Welcome to this overview of InterCapital's ETFs, what we did this year and what we expect for the coming one. We started the year with two ETFs, one covering Croatia and one covering Slovenia. As of that moment, both of them had amazing returns of 34 and 24%. At the mid of the year, we also introduced a Romanian ETF targeting their most prominent shares. And as of that moment, the ETF had also a very good performance of about 28%. We ended the year by adding something that might appeal to those of you who are more interested in a safe yield than taking the equity risk. It's the InterCapital Euro Money Market ETF. It's been on the stock exchange since the end of October, and in that period, it did a 0.6% return. What is very interesting here is that it is giving exactly what it's supposed to give, meaning stable growth with no big volatility. Every time we see such a good performance on the equity or any other market, we should ask if it was maybe too much. Did the stocks now become too pricey? And a good way to look at this is through the so-called relative prices or the multiples. The most well-known one probably is the so-called price to earnings. That's the ratio between the price you are paying and the earnings that the companies make. In other words, how many euros you pay for each euro of profits that those companies make. As you can see here, two of the markets, Slovenia and Romania, are extremely attractive at this point, meaning that they are cheaper than both the developed markets, the general emerging markets, or their peers in Europe. The one that's standing out here is Croatia, which is somewhat more expensive, but we'll touch on that a bit later. Another popular metric is the dividend yield, which basically tells us, compared to what we paid, how much we get each year through the dividends that the companies give us. Again, two markets here are very interesting. That's again Slovenia and Romania. Croatia is again somewhat lower. We already told you that we also have a money market ETF, which doesn't use these metrics, but what's interesting here is to look at their current yield, which is 3.4%. In other words, anyone who buys the ETF at this moment, assuming that there are no big changes in interests, should get about 3.4% annually. Touching on each ETF individually, let's start with Croatia. As you can see here, Croatia is very focused on the food and the tourism sector. And within the year, the 34% yield can be split among these facts. As you can see here, the food company Podravka brought the most yield, followed by Končar and the Croatian Telecom. What's very specific here, let's start with the second one, Končar, for example. They had an amazing year, much better than the average of the market, and their revenues, operating profit and net profit all grew by tens of percentage points, meaning that they really had an amazing year. Going forward, they should have another good year, taking into account how much new deals they have signed with their existing clients. The one that brought most yield, Podravka, had a specific situation in which one of the shareholders was actually increasing their stake, and they were doing so obviously by buying on the stock exchange and thereby increasing the price. The composition of the index is not the only defensive thing, namely the companies themselves also behave very defensively. I'm talking about the fact that they hold a lot of cash at this moment. So if we look at some of the big waiters like the Croatian Telecom or Adres, they have 10 to 20% of market cap in cash at this moment. This is something that's not reflected in the multiples that we talked about earlier. So for the moment, they are not using it to pay dividends, therefore the lower dividend yield. And also they're not earning profits out of this, therefore the higher price to earnings ratio. However, cash position is something that can really help you lower the risk, especially if you think that there are some macro risks and if you are concerned about the next year in that way. Next up is Slovenia, which is represented by our SBI Top ETF. And again, out of the 24% yield that we saw this year, this is how you can split it between individual companies. Not surprisingly, since Krka is the biggest weight in the index, they brought most of the yield, followed by the NLB Bank and the Petrol Group. What's very specific about Slovenia, the index has only 10 components and Krka makes about 30% of the index, meaning obviously that a lot of the story of the index is the story about Krka. They're a pharmaceutical company which had a very good year this year, actually had amazing decades and their growth rates. And also what's very good at this moment is that the company actually issued a forward-looking statement a couple of days ago for the next couple of years, where they really said that they expect growth and that they believe they will be able to manage all the risks that are coming at them. Two other big weighters are the NLB banks and the Petrol Group. The NLB Bank is at this moment profiting from the higher dividend yields. What actually happened to them and to most European banks is that they managed to hike the interest on loans while keeping the interest on deposit relatively lower. And therefore their margin increased and their profits are growing. What we see at this moment is that for the next year, according to our outlook, this should still remain the case, although obviously the growth of interest is most probably behind us. One of the biggest business lines for Petrol Group is the resale of energy products, namely oil and gas. And as such, they were obviously under the effect of the volatile prices on the energy markets that we've seen in the last couple of years. We expect this to stabilize going forward, so this too should bring a bit more ease to petrol and not that much volatility going forward. All in all, as we've already seen, Slovenia is something that's really traded on low multiples, and at this moment we believe it's a very good pick. Our newest equity ETF is Romania, and we are especially happy since we started the ETF mid of this year. We really communicated that we see a lot of potential there, and a lot of that has already happened. So the index made a yield of 28% this year, and our ETF followed that. Most of the return came from their bank, so-called Banca Transilvania, followed by their energy companies. Romania had a very specific year, namely they had the biggest IPO that's ever been seen in these countries and the fifth biggest IPO in 2023 globally. The company is Hidroelectrica, you can see it here. It also contributed quite substantially to the return of our ETF since the IPO. A specific thing about Romania is also that a lot of the index is focused on the energy market and banks. Compare this to Croatia, which is rather defensive, so this is a completely different story. Romanian energy market is specific, especially if we compare it to the rest of Europe or even globally. An interesting thing that's going on there at the moment is the commencement of the so-called Neptune Deep project, meaning taking gas out of their part of the Black Sea and putting it on the market. Some investors might be concerned about where the energy prices will go in 2024 and beyond, but a good thing here is that the heavy weighters in the index should profit from increased volumes. Another big sector there obviously is banking sector. And again, a specific thing about Romania compared to our other ETFs is that it's not a part of the Eurozone, meaning that they actually had somewhat higher interest rates for a longer time now, a healthier period for banks, we could say so. And so far, this should also continue into 2024 and maybe even beyond. So these two sectors, again, might be interesting even for the next year. One of the key points when deciding about actually beginning with this Romanian ETF was the fact that the market should now move from the so-called frontier to the emerging market. Namely, the IPO of Hidroelectrica, which we already talked about, ticked most of the boxes there and should prompt the MSCI to actually consider doing this in the coming period. This is very important because, globally speaking, a lot of more investors, and therefore a lot more assets, covers the emerging markets compared to the frontier markets. And if you remember the price to earnings ratios that we talked about earlier, you could see there that there's a big difference between the frontier index and the emerging market index, saying actually that investors are on average ready to pay more for a country or a company that's part of the emerging market compared to the frontier market. If you are not ready to take on the equity risks through our ETFs, you can also pick another one that we've introduced at the end of the year. Namely, it's the InterCapital Euro Money Market ETF. And the idea there is to provide sort of a safe haven for your investments. At this moment, the ETF yields 3.4% annually, and it's invested in the safest forms of securities that you can find on the market. So we are talking short-term papers of countries like France and Germany and some deposits. Anyone who wants to invest into our ETFs can do so on one of the following exchanges. All 4 ETFs are at this moment available in Zagreb. 2 of them are also available in Ljubljana, with the other 2 coming in January. And we expect to also offer the ETFs on the Bucharest Stock Exchange, meaning in Romania, next year as well. For all questions about trading the ETFs, feel free to talk to your local brokers, or you can also contact us directly. Thank you very much for your time.